I have a lot of mechanical keyboards. Some might say too many. I enjoy making them by combining various parts like the circuit board, key switches, case, and keycaps. I like the aesthetics of them, and I type a lot for my job, so I enjoy periodically switching keyboards. But yeah, this is probably too many. For a long time, there wasn't much overlap between the worlds of mechanical keyboards and Star Wars, but back in 2018, NovelKeys announced the very first officially licensed set of Star Wars keycaps, and since then they've released a number of them, including one themed after The Mandalorian and another after Boba Fett. But they were expensive, so I managed to avoid buying any of them until about a year and a half ago when they announced SA Tatooine. It was a set of caps based on the binary sunset scene from A New Hope, and I liked the general concept and color scheme even though it didn't exactly scream Star Wars to me. What I really liked, though, was the fact that they included a number of novelty keys for Star Wars characters and ships, including Jabba, Salacious Crumb, and the Sail Barge. So I put in my order and waited. One thing you have to know about the keyboard world is that things often take a long time, and they're often very expensive, and that was certainly the case here. This is a $250 keycap set that took a year and a half to arrive. Sounds kind of ridiculous when I say it out loud, but it does come with a really nice box. It's filled with foam, so you can keep the keycaps in place if you're storing them or something. And generally, it's just a lot more impressive than the other SA profile keycap sets that I've gotten in the past. Those just came in Ziploc bags. The box is actually made up of 2 layers of foam, so you can take off the top and reveal the second layer, which has some of the more obscure keys, I suppose you'd say, alternate keys, and the special character novelty keys that I talked about earlier. SA Tatooine is an SA profile keycap set, so the keys are kind of tall. They look a little bit more like you might see on a vintage computer than something a little bit more modern. Aside from the coloration, the character novelties are probably the things that stand out most about this set, so let's take a look at them in a little bit more detail. We have Luke's house on the left and Jabba on the right. These are enter keys, of course. I'm a little undecided about Jabba because I'm not sure how the green coloration will fit in with the rest of the set, and I kind of wish they had shown his entire body on the key, but we'll see. We've got a couple of vehicles here. We've got the sail barge and, of course, a sand crawler. These are 1.5 units in size, so they're 1.5 times wider than a normal key, and these are 1.25 units in size. We have a dewback and, of course, Luke's land speeder. We also have 2 alternate keys for your letters, the I and L, that are meant to represent the binary suns, which I think was kind of a cool idea. Like the whole keyboard is the sky, and those are the suns. Over here on the right, we have 4 other character keys, starting with Salacious Crumb at the top, Leia, a sand person, and a Jawa. We also have this key, which is intended to be a replacement escape key, but I'm kind of bothered by this Lucasfilm licensing copyright that's very prominently shown on the front of the key. I don't know why that's necessary. They also give you several sizes of force keys. All of these keys are meant to replace things like navigation keys, page up, page down, home end, that kind of thing, or modifier keys like Alt, Control, Command, Windows, that kind of stuff. Now, I should probably explain a little bit about keycap profiles. That's the shapes of the keys. This particular keyboard uses cherry profile keys, so they're kind of more squared off. But you can see if you look from the side that there are different shapes to the keys depending on the row. That's especially true with SA keycaps like the ones on this board. They have a pretty aggressive sculpt, so if you look from the side you can see how tall some of the keys are in relation to the others and how they have kind of this curved profile to them. That means that if you want to use this Salacious Crumb key, for example, due to its shape, you can really only put it in the first or second row here, which is the numbers or the function key row. And if you want to use the Jawa, you have to put it there on the bottom. That does limit your freedom quite a bit when trying to decide what layout to use. Basically, I decided it had to have these keys on the side. So that would limit me to a so-called 75% layout, which is what this is, or a 65%, which is what this is. The 65% includes the core keys from the keyboard, so the modifiers and the alphas and numbers, as well as an arrow cluster and these side navigation keys, which would be perfect for those character keys. So, for example, the Jawa here would be my end key. The plan was then to use the other keys in place of the modifier keys here on either side of the spacebar. The only problem was that the sail barge is a 1.5 unit size key, which means it won't fit on this particular board. I would have to make a special layout just to allow me to fit those two keys on there. But the beauty of making your own mechanical keyboard is you can do just that, assuming the circuit board you choose supports it, of course. After looking around at the available options for 65% keyboard circuit boards, I decided to go with the XT68 here. Cost about $30 from AliExpress and took a little over 2 weeks to arrive, I think. Here's all the equipment that I'm going to need to assemble the board, including that XT68 circuit board, which I was just talking about right here. And this is a soldered board, which means I'm going to have to do some soldering. A lot of the newer boards coming out are hot swap boards, so you can just take a keyboard switch and insert it and not have to do any kind of soldering, but they have limited layout options usually, so because I wanted a kind of strange layout, I'm going to have to solder this from scratch. If we take a little bit of a closer look at the board, you can see, especially at the bottom and the bottom right, there are all sorts of holes through this board, and that allows you to place the switches in lots of different places depending on what layout you want, but it can be a little confusing, frankly, when you're trying to figure out where you need to put things and actually doing the soldering. I also got a plate that was specially made for this PCB. A plate is basically just something that holds the switches in place. You can insert them in these little holes here, and it'll keep them from moving around, keep them in the layout that you want them in. This one is made of carbon fiber, just because I've never used a carbon fiber plate before. Sounded interesting. These are the key switches themselves that you solder onto the PCB. These are tactile switches, and they're from Zeal PC. These are called 67-gram Zelios switches, and these are some of my favorite switches. But it's a very personal thing, personal preference. A lot of people have different ideas about switches. This is my soldering iron. It's a very small and compact USB-C powered soldering iron that you could even use off of a portable battery if you want, and you can switch the tips like this. It's actually really handy compared to a traditional soldering iron. And of course, we're also going to need some solder as well. I picked up some stabilizers, which you need to make the larger keys like space go down evenly no matter where you press them. And I also have some lubricant to keep the stabilizers from sounding all nasty and rattly when you press them. I think that's the #1 problem that a lot of keyboards have, so I want to see if I can avoid that kind of problem. And finally, I have a number of other tools such as tweezers and paint brushes for applying lube, and also, almost forgot, screwdrivers. I have a screwdriver set here with a bunch of different bits that we can change out depending on what the size of screw we're using. So I think with that in mind, we're ready to start on this project. Before we get started, though, we do want to test the PCB by connecting it to a computer and shorting these little points on the circuit board where the switches go, just to make sure that they're functioning properly. You can use a keyboard tester website for this. You really do want to do this, though, because you don't want to get your board all soldered up and then find it doesn't work properly. A lot of keyboard enthusiasts do actually lube their keyboard switches, too, by disassembling them and putting lubricant inside. I'm not going to worry about that, but I am going to use lubricant on my stabilizers. Basically, if we put one of these together, you can see how they're constructed. You've got a couple of plastic pieces that fit inside each other, and then a metal piece that clips in and moves up and down. And as you can imagine, this can lead to some rattle if you're not careful. So what we want to do is put some lube in there to kind of fill up the empty space and make it so that it won't make any undesirable noises. There are a lot of videos about lubing stabilizers. I'm not really intending this to be a tutorial of any kind. I'm just going to give you an idea of what's involved, but I'm using a thinner lube here on the plastic on plastic parts, and then I'm going to be taking a thicker lube, which is dielectric grease, and kind of slathering it on the metal parts where they contact the plastic parts so that there's really no way for them to rattle. There are different kinds of stabilizers too, some attached to the plate, some attached to the PCB. These particular ones are screw-in PCB mounted stabilizers, so you snap them into these holes and then you actually use screws to attach them to the PCB. I've found that these tend to be a little bit more stable and non-rattly than some of the other types. Then I gave each of the stabilized keys a test just to make sure that everything was sounding okay. Might sound a little rattly on the video, but it sounded pretty good in person, so I was satisfied. The next step was essentially to just solder the switches onto the PCB, but I wanted to sort of placed the switches on here temporarily with some caps on them, just so I knew that I had the layout arranged properly and I was soldering things in the right places. Then I put on the plate and put some switches in the corners that I would solder in to kind of give it a little bit of stability as I was working. The switch kind of clips into the plate, and then the legs go through the PCB. You can see that they're sticking out through these holes here. When we talk about soldering the switches onto the PCB, that's what we're talking about. We're just connecting these legs to the PCB and allowing the electricity to flow. I am not that great at soldering, but I can usually get the job done. I just started learning how to do it since starting 3D printing when I had to repair some wiring on the 3D printers. Then I went ahead and put all the rest of the switches into the PCB and soldered them one after the other. There's 68 switches used here, hence the name XD68. I thought I did a relatively good job soldering this, but unfortunately, when I went to actually test the board, I found that one row had several switches that were just not functioning. So basically, anything from the spacebar to the right was not functioning on this row, and I could not figure out what the problem was, although I did find that I had scraped the PCB with a metal tool, apparently. I worked for several hours to try and fix this in various ways, but in the end I decided my only choice was to undo all of the work that I had just done and desolder all of the switches. Luckily, I had bought an extra one of these PCBs, and I had a soldering tool here, the solder sucker, that you use to just kind of suck up the melted solder. Then I just resoldered all the switches onto the new PCB. I will say I was able to do it a lot faster and better the second time through because it had been quite a while since I had done any soldering, so maybe that's a good thing. The PCB comes pre-programmed with a default layout, but I wanted to switch around a couple of keys on the board and stuff like that, customize it a little bit. So I used a software called QMK, which allows you to do that. You can go onto the website and select all these different things, choose what you want your keys to do. This is the layout that I went with, and we also have here an alternate layer that you can use when you're pushing the function key in combination with other keys, so you can control media controls and things like that. Once you've got it all to your liking, you can compile it and download the firmware, which you then use to flash your keyboard using some software called QMK Toolbox. I'm not going to get into all the details there, but it's not really all that hard if you follow directions. And here we have the PCB all finished, tested, working, with all the switches installed, and basically we just need a case, and of course the keycaps. In terms of what case to use, I had always been planning to design and 3D print some kind of a case for this project, but I wasn't entirely sure what I was going to do. In the end, I decided to kind of rework a design I made a year or two ago. This is kind of a vintage-inspired design. It's got very big bezels, and I think that goes well with this key set. But I also added these cutouts on either side to give it a little bit more visual interest. And I don't know, I think it looks a little bit sci-fi as well. First, I decided I would print a very rough version of the keyboard case just to see if I had the dimensions right. The original design I was using was for a 60% keyboard, so it would be narrower, and I needed to widen it to fit this PCB. And you can see I overshot it a little bit. It's kind of a little bit too wide, so I was glad that I did test this out, but it was more or less correct. I thought about what color to use for quite a while, but in the end I settled on this beige, which is actually more of a tan color from Duramic 3D. It's a PLA filament. I thought it would be a nice contrast for the very colorful keys, and also it's got a bit of a retro feel to it as well, and it brings to mind the sand color of Tatooine, so I think it kind of brings it all together in a nice way. At least I was hoping it would. For the final print, I decided to use a 0.1 millimeter layer height, and I also used fairly thick walls for reasons which will become obvious in a little bit. Overall, I didn't have any issues printing. It did take approximately 2.5 days to finish printing, which is a fairly long time. And after it was done, all I had to do was just take it off the print bed and get rid of some of these supports, which was not difficult at all. And here is the finished case. Well, not quite finished, as you will see, but this is the case as it came off of the printer. You can see if we turn it over, there's some more evidence of it being 3D printed, but just If you look at it from a distance, it doesn't look too bad. However, if we look closely, you can see, even at the finest layer height, that there's some fairly obvious stair-stepping here, which doesn't look fantastic. I was hoping to avoid this. You can see on this edge, there's basically no layer lines that are visible, but on any of the flat surfaces, you can really see them still. So I was going back and forth about whether I should try and sand this. I didn't want to destroy 2.5 days' work, but I decided I really should try and sand it. And here we have the case after about 45 minutes or an hour of sanding. I started out with a fairly rough grit, I think it was about 180, and then gradually worked my way up to about 2,500 or 3,000 grit, and at that point I was essentially just polishing it, but you can see it's really smooth. It feels amazing to the touch. Doesn't feel like anything 3D printed at all. And in fact, it looks more like wood. You can sort of make out very faint traces of the 3D printing layer lines that make it look like wood grain almost. So I'm really pleased with how this turned out, and I'm glad I decided to take the time to do it. Of course, on the bottom, I didn't sand it at all because it's not going to be visible, and I don't even really think you could sand it very well, but I did add some rubber feet there just to kind of keep it from sliding around as I use it. So, of course, the next step was to actually put the PCB in the case, and yes, I did actually test it before doing all the sanding and everything. It fits in there quite nicely with just a little bit of wiggle room for adjustments, but of course we want to actually attach it to the case somehow, and that's going to be our next step. You can see that there are holes in the board that are meant for inserting screws to attach it to whatever case it's in, like here. And basically what I'm going to do is just take a Sharpie, and once I've got this in the position that I want it in, go in and just mark where those screw holes are. I think this is about as good a way of doing it as any. After I've marked all the holes with the Sharpie, we can take the circuit board out and see where all the hole positions are. The next step is to take some brass knurled nuts, which are basically things that can receive screws, and I'm going to insert them into the case itself. I just put one of the nuts in place, use my soldering iron with a pointier tip this time, and use it to heat up the nut, which happens quite quickly, and just have it melt down into the filament. And you have to be careful you don't push down too much because it can go all the way through, but if you do it right, which I'm not really doing here, they will be relatively strong and you can screw into them. Now that we have all the nuts installed, we can just slide the PCB in here and use a screwdriver to screw it in. You really don't need all of these screws probably, but I figured I might as well. With that done, we can finally do what I've been waiting to do all this time, and that is to put on the keycaps and see what it looks like in its finished form. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll have to say I'm really liking the way this color combination looks. The only thing I'm not totally sure about is which enter key to use. Of course, I've got Luke's house on here right now, but let's go ahead and try out Jabba in its place. So we'll just use my little keycap removal tool here to pull that off carefully and slide the new one on. You know, at first, when I put it on, I was not quite sure this was going to work out. It seemed like it was a little too colorful, but it's really growing on me now that I've been using the board for a while, and I think I may stick with Jabba. I hope I don't sound like a broken record, but I really can't get over how good this sanded PLA filament looks and feels. I have sanded PLA in the past with some fairly decent results, but this is the best I've gotten. It really looks like it could be some kind of high-end plastic or wood, as I mentioned earlier. Just to get a closer look at the keys, even this copyright indicator here on the escape key doesn't really bother me as much as I thought it would now that it's on the board. I really like the way this has come together overall, and especially these keys in the center here, the I and the L. I think it's a clever idea. I like that. And of course we have the other character novelties that I worked so hard to get on the board. And Jabba in the center there, really starting to grow on me. One minor issue is that because of these very large bezels, the actual PCB of the board is recessed a fair amount in there, so you have to reach in about an inch to plug in the cord, but it's not that big of a deal. It's not my best sounding keyboard probably, it's kind of hollow sounding, which may be unavoidable with this design and using 3D printed parts, but overall I think it sounds pretty decent, and it doesn't really have any rattle to it, which is what I was most concerned about. I hope you enjoyed coming along with me on this journey. We did have a couple of bumps along the way, but I'm really happy with how the final product turned out. Thanks very much for watching. And thanks as always to my Patreon supporters, including these Palace VIPs, Angelica Brady, and Jesper Murtu. If you'd like to know how you can help support the channel for as little as $1 a month, check out the link in the video description.